Welcome, everyone. Dr. Thor Templar here, and we're going to do another book report on an interesting book about a religious movement that's been around for many years. And that's, the name of the book is The Prophet's Daughter, My Life with Elizabeth Clare Prophet, Inside the Church, Universal and Triumphant. Well, I was interested in finding out more about this organization. I had some contact with it in the late 70s or I guess 80s, and worked with a couple of people that were members of that church, where they were at that time. Their main headquarters were in Southern California, and she used to be on the radio there, and I used to listen to Elizabeth Clare Prophet on the radio as I was driving to work. And as I said, I worked with a guy who was not a very good person, who was part of the church, a lazy guy, not interested in much of anything, and didn't talk much about the religion itself, even though I told him that I knew of it. Now, this book is written by Erin Prophet, one of her daughters, and it's an interesting belief system. Of course, it comes from, as most nutjob religions, which they all are, by the way, including Buddhism and the Tibetans, who have done absolutely nothing, as well as the diaper-wearing Indians, who have done absolutely nothing. So we need to understand that. We need to understand there is none of these thoughts that have any value. There's only one path that has value, and that's the path to wisdom, otherwise known as gnosis, or Christ consciousness, which has nothing to do with Jesus. So Jesus became the Christ per the fantasy story there. So the whole idea is that it's interesting to see religions and how they screw themselves up and where their people come. Now, this really was a religion based on a 1920 typical spiritualist movement, the I Am movement. And one thing I find interesting about this, and of course my book reviews are all geared from a manifesting scientist reality. What were they doing? What were the techniques they were using to empower themselves? And what's very interesting here is they had a way of psyching themselves up called decrees. They decreed. They shouted and called for bolts of lightning to affect bad people and for good things to happen. And they did this in groups and so forth. And this is a typical technique of a lot of Christian groups that get together and they have pray circles and they pray for things, otherwise known as psychically affecting, using their psions to interact with their occultons that make up all of matter to form it in their direction. The problem is this is that what are they doing, and are they practicing empowerment? Well, this is a prime example of how you can generate lots of energy and not get anywhere. And it's very interesting to note all these things. Now we can get back into the I Am movement. The I Am movement. It is interesting that both people involved in this, Mark Prophet, who started this church and then later married Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Nobody people basically that picked up this, but what else she was a physicist. She wouldn't have gone into religion, so everybody has their place. But I do appreciate the idea of understanding that there are, quote, ascended masters, and I've used this term in the past as well, and we still use this in our inner order to a degree, and these are just connections, streams that you connect to of higher intelligence. And we give them faces and names to relate to them. So they certainly were interested in this whole belief system of connecting to these different ascended masters, Saint Germain, other ones. She wrote many books along with her daughter. And this is an interesting book that is somewhat balanced. But as with everything in life, people have problems about any types of people who tend to be dominating, but who isn't dominated by their parents in general? So your parents control your life, they tell you what to do, and if you're in a business with them that they are running, you're going to have to do what they tell you. And all of this becomes very interesting of how things work. And like most of these organizations, they all tend to do the same thing, which is tend to turn into money-making machines with little conscience. They don't take care of their people. They use them as slaves. As a matter of fact, they expected you to be a slave, a chela, which is another word for dedicated slave of sorts. So, and this is, of course, how they look at people, or how they use people, and then they wonder why there were problems. One thing interesting about this church is that it basically dealt with what would be considered almost Scientology-like people, 90% white, semi-middle class people who were looking for something other than the ridiculous religions that we all grew up with, and didn't find much fulfillment there or much interest. After all, they are pretty boring. So when we move on to this type of thing, it is interesting. So it is not this odd class of people or anything else. It's this typical type of strange, actually, group that appear that white people fall into, like Scientology, who are seeking, and what they tend to get involved in is organizations that tend to be corporate and more normal-ish. So, now she had several children. Of course, they go into the usual things that happen. Now, as I said, the I Am movement, which was started by a bunch of old women in the 1920s, spiritualists connected, and of course, they were a try to live forever cult, and of course, you could do that through the old myth perpetrated, particularly coming from the Indians. Oh, yeah, the Indians in the curry, and which is the fact that, or at least some of the major schools of Indian Yogic Hindu thinking, which is that sex kills you because you're draining your vital force. A great misinterpretation, just like bringing your energy up from the root chakra, going up to the crown. So you bring all the garbage with it. So these are the type of things that have been taught in their traditions for thousands and thousands of years that are 100% wrong. And that's why India is the big mess it is today, and has achieved absolutely nothing, just like, guess who? The Tibetans. Absolutely nothing. Zero, 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 zero. And then you take 1,000,000 zeros and add that onto it. That's how much they've done. So when we get into these things, we need to look at that. So these bunch of old, cranky, ugly women who couldn't get sex decided that they wanted to, or didn't want to participate, which is very typical of the problematic female gender, and which causes all kinds of problems. It's not sex that's the problem. It's the fact that nobody's doing sex right. And there's a purpose and an energy exchange for sex. And if you don't do it right, it becomes something that is extremely negative in your life and does tend to drain your energy. And it does, but does it stop you from people? There are many, many people, particularly a vast number of women that don't have sex for most of their life, yet they don't live longer in terms of long times. Women have always lived a little longer than men because of the less stress factor. But there's never been any really long living people because of the not having sexual contact. Matter of fact, it's the opposite, because you are lacking that very important energetic field that is opposite from you to balance you. And you need those energies to live longer, not the other way around. So these are the typical things. So this group of people, particularly in the 30s, decided that they were going to do this. And of course, anybody that got in their way, they were going to scream at them with decrees. Satan, I send you a lightning bolt and keep you away from me. And the interesting part of that is they did have a very manifesting scientist, occult scientist view of things, of energies. Another odd group that, per this book, and of course it's very contradictory, as usual with most of these groups. They were into alternative health, into other things, trying to not go through the typical things that society offer. Yet on the other hand, she states in the book, and you have to wonder if she didn't get it herself, and while it's not a nasty book, people should be involved in working to make what they're involved in better instead of attacking it and leaving it. She prospered quite well from everything and continues to, from book royalties and everything else, and the organization continues today. And as I said, I think it is kind of interesting. Because they are based on ascension and so forth, but they also have these strange things that, of course, will kill any religion or belief system, and that is their sexual problems, and they're not even wanting to produce children, which is a death to any organization. All organizations that are survive, I mean, quite frankly, Mormonism created their own religion by isolating themselves and having hundreds of thousands of babies. They created their own church because they never really got that many converts. If you can't get converts, what do? You make people. So that's how it all goes. So you make a giant religion out of your own people and then eventually this expands to a degree. But, Mormonism in terms of a growth religion within the United States and probably all other Western countries is pretty much zero. They're getting their growth from people who are seeking a way to get into the Western world to prosper. So they go to Africa and other places where people will grab onto anything to get out of their country because there's absolutely no opportunities there. So that's where their major growth is. Even though Mormonism tends to be racist as a general rule, but they're changing that because they have no way of growing without that. So as we get into all that stuff, we need to understand that. Of course, there wasn't any. This organization wasn't racist per se, but when you have a bunch of white people getting together, you're not going to feel too comfortable. Even though one of the people I knew that got involved in the church because she had a crush on the guy who was in the church was a Mexican girl, and I'm assuming now today there's a huge Mexican movement for this whole area, and they are taking in large amounts because the only way they're going to find people who are kind of metaphysically based are the Latins, which is kind of built into their makeup. White people don't do anything. So the whole idea is that as we move into these areas, we need to understand. It's interesting. So the point is they start off with this and that. Since you start off with the thing of don't have sex, don't have this, well, you're limiting, as I just mentioned, not only your growth of your organization, but you're not going to get very many people overly interested in that. So that was one of the major hang-ups. And the one thing I found throughout the book that seemed to be the way that their daughter revolted. One of her major problems in life is that she couldn't be sexual the way she wanted to. They had interesting sexual, they find out that ultimately Elizabeth Clare Prophet had an affair with someone and practiced the things they weren't supposed to practice. Now, the basic policy of the church was sex only twice a week, which would be intercourse only. Homosexuality was outlawed, so was oral sex, and so was anal sex. So that's all. You couldn't do any of that, which became very common practices throughout the 70s and 80s when the film Deep Throat came out. And before that, oral sex was considered filthy, dirty, and horrible. I've even had women in high school tell me how terrible that was, when today it's considered not even sex. Because only sex is considered intercourse, which is interesting. Yeah, it certainly wasn't like that in the 70s, which was considered that oral sex was a no-no, and anal sex wasn't even considered back then. All that has now changed for better or worse, whatever how you look at it. But they had these rules. And so younger people, of course, who tend to be much more sexual, revolted against this. Yet, and nobody really liked this. And of course, telling people not to have children, discouraging all that stuff, certainly is not good for any organization. So, as went on, it turned out that Elizabeth Clare Prophet was an epileptic and had all sorts of seizures, and particularly later in life where she developed dementia and seizures and everything else, and eventually, and this is always sad, it's always sad to see people. I saw this recently with so many people. It happened with I think it was Dam Doss or whatever his name, Ram Doss or whatever his name is. This guy took that name, who then had a stroke and is trying to tell everybody how advanced he is when he's physically completely messed up. This happened with Scientology follower or the Scientology leader as well, where he went into horrible mental states at the end of his life, which has been fairly well recorded with L. Ron Hubbard. But it happens to everybody. We see this with the Pope, who is then drooling on himself, falling asleep in masses. It's quite amazing to show how really unempowered everybody is when they get to these ages. And of course, you can't, you're not supposed to resign as Pope, except of course one Pope did resign because he was getting so feeble. And of course, that was the smart move to make, and that should be something that is done in general so people don't have such a horrible representation and die in the office. And you don't die jumping around, speaking well and looking good. You die as a feeble, pooping on yourself person. So it's a horrible representation, but it is a representation of what this life is all about. And we keep telling you this is the hell plane. There is no escaping it. You're not going to change it, I should say. There's no changing it. There's only escaping it. You have to escape this thing by ending the reincarnation cycle. So with all that, we all need to understand that this is the way things work, and we need to continue to actually go through the ascension process. Now, they talked about this, and one thing they really didn't talk about too much in the book here was their belief systems past how she was affected and her family was affected. And of course, considering how all families are affected and the kind of opulent lifestyle that she had and the kind of immediate celebrity she had, it's very interesting that people, of course, fight against this stuff instead of helping build an organization. One of the problems is, as she was becoming more unstable, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, the leader, she got onto what so many people get into. And I've heard this from almost every single person that is alternative, particularly that has any kind of, quote, Jesus or Christian syndrome, that they believe in that, is that it's all about the end of the world. And this sells a lot of tickets, gets a lot of radio shows, and people love to hear about everything's happening. In the last 40 to 50 years, I think there's been at least 5 or 6 times that the world was supposed to come to an end. The millennium, 2000, everything's going to happen. The computers are going to go down. We're going to go back to caveman age because the computers won't work. Nada. Never happens. The giant earthquake's going to come. I lived in Southern California for over 40 years. And while I did go through some major earthquakes, the devastating earthquake that is always prophesized there never happens. People talk about the end of the world and it never happens. Life is not that simple. Sure, most what happens is not even horrific wars, which we really haven't had in terms of world wars in over 70 years. What happens is natural disasters, giant tsunamis that hit Asia, and the hurricanes that hit the southern coast of America. These are the kind of things that happen and happen relatively frequently, which has absolutely nothing to do with us whatsoever. It just happens. It's part of nature, and as nature changes on this living planet, everybody gets affected by it. So nothing really happens in terms of that. And I think that this whole thing about nuclear wars and everything else, well, who wants to do this? Do you think the Chinese with their bags of gold up to the moon want to start a war so they can't get to their whores, dopes, and all the stuff they're buying from the U.S.? You really think they want to do that? Well, I think it's nonsense, even though everybody loves to talk tough. And of course, I guess this gets the average guy going in their community, and there's tough talk by Russia and China because, they're all macho guys there. Russia, who's really never done anything and couldn't win in Afghanistan and Chechnya and other places, and talk so tough all the time. What are they going to do? And of course, they're going to rattle their sabers, and this could be potentially dangerous, but basically in the end, everybody backs off. And of course, this has happened pretty much everywhere. So those kind of things just don't seem to ever happen in terms of massive wars. And I don't think massive wars serve any purpose anymore because there's too much destruction. You mess up your economies. But war is good. It's very profitable. So you get a bunch of people all stirred up and everything else. We see that what's happening. What are you going to do with a $1 trillion economy in the United States that's based on a war machine? You're going to have to use it. So you're going to find reasons to use it, and ultimately, what is going on in the Middle East and everything is controlling a group of people who want to murder everybody else. So in its own perverse way, it is serving a great purpose like the Crusades themselves served. So the whole idea is that we need to understand that. So as we get into this church, it's very interesting. So that's one of the things that already, and you have to wonder how many people really followed that. How do you enforce those rules that are talked about? And I think in a lot of religions, and probably this one as well, people didn't take so many things so seriously. This is typical of Catholics, who the Pope comes out and tells everybody to do all sorts of things, and nobody pays attention to it. It's considered just to be a part of the churchianity of life, and I'm assuming some of that was here as well. One of the problems I found with this, and wasn't stressed enough in the book as far as I'm concerned, is how people were treated pretty poorly, even though it is mentioned frequently. And that is the fact that, people worked for the system and they were treated pretty badly. They weren't paid. They were kept in mediocre housing. Nobody took care of anybody. And as such, the reality of that is that that's pretty nasty. And I've always disliked this in terms of it, but I also understand on a certain level as a leader is that a lot of people don't understand when you treat them good, and they see you as a sucker. So there's a problem with this, and there's a big issue here, but I'm not going to go into that in this particular book review. But they didn't. They had help and everything, and if you got into any health problems, you didn't like the way you did anything, they just fired you, and you didn't have any money or anything else. They basically threw you out, and there were people who worked for many, many years that were dismissed. So if you got sick because they didn't want to pay your medical bills, they got rid of you. Well, that's very high conscious? I don't think so. So they didn't set up very good systems there. They seem to have lots of money in one aspect and not in others. And of course, here's a person who started to have extreme problems in her 40s and 50s. And she died at the age of 70, which is pretty young in general, with a life expectancy in the United States at that time, probably 78 or so. It's actually dropped now. So, that's the average life expectancy. But she was sick from her entire life. Apparently, she sustained some head injuries as a child, had horrible headaches and other things. So the point is that these things, while they also enable you to be more spiritual because you've now had some physical damage to your head that allows you to think differently, can flop over into epilepsy, seizures, and complete irrational thinking, which didn't entirely seem to happen here. What happened was the typical I'm important, the world's coming to an end reality, which people want to blame her and say how terrible it is, but they've all done this. All of these religions, particularly Christian-based, and that's what really the Bible says, doesn't it? Everything's coming to an end. At least that's how people interpret it, and I don't think it really means that. I think there's also a Armageddon of understanding where you go on to another level. Everything breaks down. I think a lot of this stuff is more allegory than it is to be based in fact. But she's written this entire book. She's not working within the organization anymore, which is still going because of their investments and their land holdings, which they eventually converted into cash. They have lots of money to keep their ministry going, and they do have quite a following. They built their own communities and did all this stuff. And a lot of that was very positive. They went and they built bomb shelters, and of course, because there was this urgency to get everything done, things were done sloppily, badly, and they ran into certain problems by doing this. And of course, with all these types of prophecies, they never ever come true. As I just mentioned, there is no major wars that are going to happen because there's too much destructive energy we have now. People are not going to shoot nuclear weapons off. That's all a con to keep the military-industrial complex very rich. And it works. And it continues to work. So the whole idea of planning for that, or what should have been planned for more, is their upheavals, and what you want to do is take care of your own group and build your own society. That's the only way to prosper. If you don't do that, you're going to be infected by common society and their belief systems. Whether those are good or bad is your personal judgment. So they never really were a violent group trying to do anything. They were trying to build bomb shelters to survive and bring their belief system back. I mean, Scientology does this. All religions do this. That they want to have something left. Scientology is a giant structure built, I believe, in the desert somewhere that is fortified, that if anything happens, their teachings will be left. So if Martians come here 2,000, 10,000 years from now and they start excavating the planet, they're going to find these giant stores of Scientology information. God forbid. So the whole idea is that, but this is a fact. And there's major abuses within that church from what's been reported. Now, there certainly is so much of it, you can't refute it as just people that are bitter from getting a lot of money. They've been thrown out of countries and everything else. There's something intrinsically wrong with Scientology when there's so much negativity. Certainly, there's a lot of good things about Scientology as well, just like there's a lot of good things about Elizabeth Clare Prophet's teaching, but that's everything. The point is, does it build anything? That's why I have problems with all religions. Well, aren't they basically good? What have they built in 4,000 years? Nada. So what has Christianity really done? 2,000 years of running the show, and what's happened? Absolutely nothing. The world certainly isn't any better. Not only that, most people have rejected Christianity as Muslimism, or Islam, is taking over the world with a huge birth rate. So it's just a matter of time, people, that this entire. And of course, they've been doing that since their inception with massive invasions. So the whole idea is that as we keep moving in these areas, we need to recognize all that. So, it's hard to give validity to anything, but they do stress ascension and so forth, but they also are not living with the reality that you're a physical being, and mastering the physical plane is very important. So, well, I don't know if she lived an opulent lifestyle. She certainly lived better than most other people in her organization. As I said, what my major problem was is they didn't really take care of anybody, and even didn't want to take care of her when she got sick, which is very interesting. But hey, as you reap, as you sow, you reap, whatever it is. The whole idea is they didn't want to take care of her, and her daughter pushed to make sure that she was put in taken care of properly in some sort of private home, which I'm sure was costly to a degree, but certainly that's what was done with her. But it's like most people, and I hear this from so many other out there recently, from the daughter of Fred Bell, of how crybaby they were, that they didn't have a proper life and a mother. When you have people that are in major movements, who have special information, who are doing things, and I'm afraid you're not going to have a typical parent. So the whole idea is that's how life is, and nobody that has anybody of any kind of particular position in life has whatever a normal household is. I'm sure if they came home every night without any money, and they couldn't give them all the things they wanted or send them to the schools they wanted to go to, and they all went to top schools, all the kiddies, USC and other things, and that didn't cost a nickel, it cost tens of thousands of dollars a semester, they would have bitched about that. Well, you weren't out there enough to make money so I could go and do things. So, like any, and it doesn't seem like they really got a lot of the things. While they went through different health stages, and she had a great belief in alternative medicine, which is, again, failed her, which is unfortunately true, but I don't think they knew that much in these areas. They were meat eaters sometimes, other times they weren't. They went to India because they didn't really have any good meditative systems, talked to gurus who weren't very interested in what they were talking about, but from there they were given strict vegetarian diets and other things which they weren't following. So they had a lot of strange beliefs instead of following that, even though a lot of their followers were vegetarians. but it should have been a policy. If you're going to ascend, that's part of what you do. So there's so many things. Of course, they didn't get any of the, other than abstention from sex, they didn't get any practices and so forth to use empowerment that way. That would have been too affronting to her, a female, and their problems they have with sexuality that is added to by spiritual belief systems. Of course, she didn't follow it, and her daughters, of course, as soon as they could, turned into little slut muffins and did everything they possibly can to break that's so important in life. And it was just something you could really break easily without getting into all that much trouble. So the whole idea is that she resented all that, and it seemed to be one of the biggest things in her books is that she couldn't hump around the way she wanted to or do other things. And of course, I find that so childish. But all of this, and the fact that she couldn't adjust to the world properly, coming from a very sheltered, very provided for reality, I found all very amusing. Now, looking at this in terms of what they did, they got involved in, and I'm spending a little more time on this because this is an interesting book in terms of your manifesting science. So, what did they do? So, in terms of this decreeing, which basically is a psychic state, which they then sent their psychic energy individually and by groups at different people and so forth. They got involved in a bad legal case, and as such was in court and faced potentially huge amounts of penalties against them in the tens of millions. Now, they did lose the case, and they lost the case and only had to pay $1.5 million. The point is they did lose, and only one person on that jury, which is all that it takes, went against this and kept down the actual settlement. But they decreed to win this, and they were found in error in this particular case, which I think is relatively bogus, against them. Some disgruntled ex-employee didn't like certain things, which is ridiculous from the case from what I could see, and had absolutely no responsibility, but decided to sue them anyway. One of these typical silly cases out there, while the average guy who needs to sue somebody never has a chance. So how this went and so forth is, and I won't go into that here and make this into a 10-hour review. But they lost. They had other people they went against, and they lost, and they lost. There was a lot of things they lost, and of course there were some things they won, including getting permits to build all these different shelters and everything else. Now, I don't know if that was something that was difficult to get or not, but it was very interesting that a lot of the people they had problems with in situations that they decreed against, otherwise known as doing a thought form ritual against them, didn't seem to work. So decreeing, calling on these spirits to go help them, sending out bolts of energy to protect themselves from people. And they did this all the time. So if there was a negative energy person around them, they would decree against them, saying, bring me bolts of protection, do this. Very similar to what would be done in a ritual or a manifesting energy situation, where you generate protection, you generate well-being, you uncross yourself from negativity. So that's what I found interesting about this. And they were doing that in their own way, using their particular spirits, and of course doing this decree stuff. Now, what's interesting is the decrees are not really a state of empowerment. They're an emotional state. And I've talked about how emotions are basically worthless. Once you get into emotions, you're turning off your manifesting abilities. Now, at very high levels of emotion, you can create some uncontrolled PK, meaning knock things off shelves, etc. This has been proven through lots of studies. But it's not controlled. It's not manifesting anything. It's a destructive energy, and that's one of the problems there. Destructive energies can have their place, but only if they're controllable. So these decrees apparently didn't do anything. And the fact that I am the center of the universe, I am God, I'm making this happen, the I am movement, and they would do these chants constantly to empower themselves and to bring energies and other things, are all part of a process that really doesn't seem to work very well. Obviously, she did build an organization, and a fairly wealthy one. A lot of people jumped on the bandwagon, and they were able to have a lot of money, and to make the moves and so forth. But and a lot of good things happened to them, including them selling their California properties, their Malibu ranches, which they were able to purchase for a huge profit, having millions of dollars then to take somewhere else where they bought more land up in Montana. So we can't say that this church is actually didn't manifest what they wanted. They certainly did. In certain areas, and then they were hit in other areas. And this is this hit and miss thing that's always confusing in these areas. But when it came down to their decrees manifesting things, it didn't really seem to work. And doing it from an emotional viewpoint instead of channeling, connecting to the stream of empowerment as manifesting scientists do, drawing that into your life, didn't seem to work very well. Even though there obviously was this group that followed that. So, once you get on radio and TV and other things, you get these ministries that can grow very quickly. And it certainly did, and they certainly were able to achieve a lot of things. They had different problems. They were harassed by locals, particularly up in Montana. You've got this group of people moving in. It's just common. It doesn't matter who you are, but generally when you have things like this, you run into these problems with the locals who don't like you because you're different. So they had this entire thing there, and of course, people running around saying the world's going to end and build bomb shelters tends to upset people. There was a bogus issue of people buying guns and other things, and a bad decision made by someone in the organization to buy guns under an assumed name, which of course is very illegal. There's nothing wrong with buying guns. Why he decided to use an assumed name to try and hide this transaction, I guess for publicity reasons, certainly is dangerous when you're buying huge amounts of guns and ammunition. It's going to be hard to hide that. It's kind of stupid when it's legal. But he didn't want that getting out to the public and upsetting the locals, so forth. But, protecting yourself is all part of life. So I'm not sure. But certainly Montana is full of guns and everybody there owns guns. So as all of those things are, it's a very interesting way of people looking at things. And of course, one of the problems is when you get a leader who is hypocritical, who's not taking care of his people. I mean, it's pretty much of a carbon copy here. And of how they take care of people and how they don't really understand how to run a business. And this is one of the problems with so many organizations, particularly with the military, who then is given charge of rebuilding a country, setting up all these structures. Well, they have no business doing this. They know nothing about that. Certainly a military general should not be involved in the reconstruction of a country. They should be involved in security, making sure those rebuilding the country, the civilians, are safe and can do their job. So when you get people like this who are supposed to be spiritual and then they have to figure out how to run a business, set up land, do all the other things, it becomes a nightmare when someone who's really not qualified to do any of that. So it is a very interesting thing, and it's interesting to look at what were they doing to manifest and protect themselves. And this decreeing, when it came to critical areas, most of the time seems to have failed. Again, they're using emotional energy, which turns off their psychic power. And certainly you would say, well, this emotional energy was there to connect to the spirits. Well, it didn't work. The spirits or the ascended masters certainly didn't seem to assist in a lot of critical areas. So what do you make of something like that? The fact is they had a lot of money, they had a lot of people, and they were able to pull it out of the fire to a degree. And with all these organizations, because of the nature of them and the lack of stability in terms of taking care of individual people and the hangers-ons, the problematic people, the serious ones that come in, you've got a massive amount of conflict because you have this. When you start setting up and telling people how to operate sexually, you run into further problems. And certainly is very interesting. And as I said, I wonder how many people really paid attention to that in the bigger picture, other than kind of saying, well, yeah, that's one of those things that they're involved in and you deal with the rest of it. The same thing with so many people that were not in their bomb shelter locations in Montana. They had other groups, fairly large ones, all over the United States and the world, who weren't involved in this. And these people had nothing to do at that particular time. I believe it was like 5 to 10 years where they had this Armageddon preparedness for. And the whole idea is that, but not everybody was there, not everybody took it all that seriously, even though that's where all their money went to. And of course, trying to put all these things together, trying to get the professional people to set up these, and you got to have the right kind of construction. And of course, they were harassed with that as well. They had people who put in giant fuel tanks, which conveniently leaked at all the seams. Well, that was obviously done deliberately, and that's not her fault. They put things in properly. They had good people. They paid a lot of money, and when they leaked, they cleaned them up, and even were cited for their great work by the state of Montana, who said the cleanup was done very well. It certainly wasn't their fault. There was nothing they did wrong. The contractors deliberately did this to sabotage them, as far as I allege. So the whole idea is that, and there are many instances of this. The problem is when you get into people who want to be so controlling of you, and when there seems to be a lack of concern for the average person who is really the support of everybody. The average person coming in, and maybe they don't have much money, but you're paying them very little. They're being assisting the organization, are treated pretty poorly. The pawns of life are just that, and people just throw them away as you would in a chess game for whatever suits you. But it is very interesting when you get into those particular areas and you see how this particular organization work. But, anytime that you build an organization on human beings, you're going to have problems. I've never met anybody who was very advanced or anything else. I have no use for the Dooley Luma, the Poppies, all the other people, the head yucky yuck from Zen and everything else. I mean, the bottom line is that, if you really want to understand, all these people pee and poo, they all got nasty attitudes, they all get sick. The bottom line is that they're far from anything but human, and generally fall into all sorts of categories. If you read about these different gurus, you find out that most of them are really overboard sexually, have all sorts of problems. I mean, Sai Baba has been accused time and time again. It's been alleged that he's been molesting all kinds of boys. He's a child molester, it appears, and there's just one story after another. So it's hard to say if it's disgruntled people and his shenanigans and his magic tricks and everything else to go with him. The yogis in general in India have been shown to be little horny devils. The Beatles that went over to an ashram there had all the yogis wanted to do was to fuck all their wives. And it goes on and on and on of their uncontrolled sexuality, which is pretty sad from spiritual people that don't know the right ways to channel and use sexuality and tend to abuse other people. So it goes on and on with these people. Zen people are known to beat their pupils horribly. And it goes on with so many other people. I believe some person fell in love with a woman that he thought was his mother reincarnated. Well, that's pretty bizarre in itself. But we go through more and more of this when you read these interesting facts about these people. And, the problem in life is you're never going to find anybody that's well-rounded. They're going to have one particular problem or another. And you have to really use the good information they have and learn to toss out that other stuff and not get entangled in it. If a church has really bad sexual practices in terms of what they expect from you, you ignore it and use the good stuff, which is what I'm assuming a lot of people in this organization did. You take it like everything, like the Catholics do, and the fact is the church said never use contraception. Well, some people paid attention, and that's why certain groups had huge amounts of children. Other ones, of course, and the most people in the church did use something, so they didn't constantly get pregnant, which they couldn't afford to do. When you look at things, was there a perfect organization? Did they have problems? Well, when you're involved in society, there's no way around it. Even the law case that they actually lost, and you would think, well, if they had empowerment, they would have won. But the actual, of the 12 jurors, 11 of them wanted to give compensation to this guy for virtually nothing. That's not going to go into the case, of $100 million. So the whole idea is that would have destroyed the entire organization. What happened is $1.5 million award, which eventually was even less than that when they paid it out, was not that much for an organization like this to handle. So you could say that was a victory. It's very hard to be in society and say that you are a failure for it. Did things go as smooth as they want, considering the fact that she was in dementia in her last 10 to 20 years running the church, so they claim, and was in and out of things and had all these problems. And this, as again, this is, there should be structures to handle this, and people shouldn't be running important areas. If you're spiritual, you're spiritual. I'm not sure you should be figuring out how to dig holes somewhere or build houses or making financial decisions either. I mean, I don't think that's appropriate. That's what a manager of an organization should be doing that's familiar with those areas. So the whole idea is, what did you bring through, whatever things are? What's a very Rosicrucian viewpoint, which is where her husband, who started the church, ended up in. So he went from these different Christian movements. She brought it back to more of the I Am movement, which is these decrees, as I've mentioned, and a lot of their belief systems, and the fact that they wanted to live or for long periods of time, and this was equated from antiquated, stupid thinking from the Hindus and the Indian yogis, that of course you didn't have sex. And the point is that, which of course involves a lot of processes of channeling these built up sexual energies through your body. Now, this wasn't stated as a practice that was done in this particular church, so it would have no effect whatsoever. Sexual energies that build up are naturally dissipated out of your body, and you don't use them unless you do certain practices. But that's a whole nother story, which I will someday talk about in my book covering all this. But we need to understand of what did this church actually do in that. So they were basically very successful, which is considered a relatively odd belief system, and they were able to get a lot of people together to do things, and they achieved quite a bit. Yet you're going to bang into society in many different ways. There's no way around it. If you move to a place, their neighbors harassed them, attacked them, shot at them, did all sorts of things. It's very typical of the peace-loving Christians who don't like other Christians. They don't seem to have the, quote, balls to go and shoot at other religions who want to kill them. Well, that's another story, but should be thought about. So the whole idea is that as a belief system and using these types of energies makes a lot of sense. And of course, they can't grow either, as I've mentioned, and now they're taking in huge groups and have all sorts of places in Latin countries where people are more open to these things. As I mentioned with the Mormons, who can't really get anybody from the United States either. So it's a very interesting book to see. And as I said, we're trying to look at the practical things that they were doing and how they were manifesting. How do these organizations and people that get involved in these things, well, you have to follow along. How seriously you take it depends upon how much enforcement is done with these things. But needless to say, the one things that I find with all these organizations, and of course, religions do tend to take care of their people. The Catholic Church pays their priests and takes care of them in retirement and other places. So these are things you do. It doesn't seem like any of this was set up for anybody in this organization, yet there certainly was a lot of money to do it. She didn't necessarily was paid a lot, nor did she live in opulent mansions and so forth to a degree. Of course, having certain places like in Malibu and other places which are status symbols is a great thing to attract people, and these are used as places for people to come and meet, etc. So it certainly is to show your empowerment in life instead of going to an apartment in Van Nuys somewhere where everybody says, gee, can't you afford something better? So the whole idea is that this is what all places do, and the opulence that is usually done by religions is way overboard. And I don't see this organization necessarily doing that, nor did she benefit that much. She was the leader. She had a few more things than other people, lived better, obviously. So what? It's the way it should be. Should your leader be living next to you? That's when you act like that, you get disrespect because people want to be abused. They want to be shown to be a lesser person than the leader. There's an old cliche with ministers is always look better than your congregation. So This is really so true in the psychological battle that goes on between trying to get people to work together and the need for finances and your position there. So it never seems to work well when you treat people too nice, on the other hand. So, and I personally went through this with a bunch of people, and they have done nothing but see you as a sucker. So, the fact that she didn't find fulfillment within the church and ultimately left it after writing numerous books and even benefiting from the sale of those books in terms of royalty today is interesting. The whole idea is to fix something that's broken if there's value in it, but the entire family apparently has decided that there is no value in the organization's beliefs because of what mommy did, and of course I don't quite understand that. So they've disregarded it because she was the church, and when organizations go down, which is basically the leaders die, which they're going to, and when they don't do it very gracefully, there are all sorts of problems that arise from that, because people then see, well, why haven't we been able to overcome what's going on? What's interesting is nobody's been able to overcome these things. Certain practices for people in certain religions tend to have them live longer, but Asians tend to live longer in general, and people that live certain lifestyles tend to live longer, but they're not really living like to be 150 and 200 years old. So somebody lives to be, and of course it's not difficult in this day and age with a lot of people that they reach 90, even though life expectancy is still not much more than it has. As a matter of fact, it's been dropping in the United States for the last 5 years in terms of life expectancy because of the new modern diseases, which of course the major problems with blood sugar or diabetics, which is pretty much almost 2/3 of the country is pre-diabetic. So this is, of course, causing all sorts of problems and decreasing life span within the United States. Other places are living a bit longer, but what does that mean, a bit longer, and what conditions are people? So the point is that people who live very extreme lives and are very controlled and have a lot of support tend to live longer, like yogis. But they live in a false reality. They live in ashrams and other places. They don't have that stress. All the people that live longer, except the Italians, who are living just as long as the Japanese, have a family structure that takes care of them. The Oriental structure generally takes care of them. So people start a new life at 80 years old because they're going to live another 20 years. Now, in Italy, they're having the same results with less of a family structure, but guess what? They still have that Italian family structure, which is always known to have strong family values. So with all this, we have these complete understandings of the reality of what's happening when we try and use supernatural measurements against very natural people. And as usual, it happens with all these groups, no matter what they are, is they all run by humans. They have higher than human aspects, which it should be. You should have values that are not based in, we're going to die here quickly. We're going to think like everybody else. Well, what's the point of being an organization? But the bottom line is that getting past that and having certain technologies or other things, whether it's spiritual or otherwise, is something that is very difficult to have a group of people implement to get the kind of results that impress people. So this is all part of life, and of course, you have to be careful with any kind of cults. All these pseudo-Christian cults, like Heaven's Gate, who killed themselves and thought they were going to go on a spaceship, and it goes on and on with these things. But as I mentioned, this doom and gloom is nothing new. There was the 2000, everything's going to collapse. Then there was 2012, the Mayan. Before that, there was 1990, and that was because of 1990 there was going to be floods. And we must remember that California was going to fall into the ocean. The entire state was going to break up and everything else that Edgar Cayce said would happen in 1968. Well, last time I checked, California is still one big piece of land, and it's still there. Now, massive land movements like that would destroy most of the planet or severely harm it if you're going to push all this water around. So people don't understand that. It still is one planet. The water has to go somewhere. So it would create horrible problems all around the world. But that didn't happen either. So none of these big things that happen in terms of people talk about should be more looked at allegorically as the fact that we're going to go through some horrible transformation, or not even horrible. The destruction means a new start. You break something down, you start new. We do this all the time in life and everything else. Things are preserved for as long as they can to a certain degree if they have any value. But if they don't have value, like a 1950s office building, you break it down. You smash it, you draw it all away, you now start over again. So, I mean, these are things that people have to look at and understand and you think that a leader would be more allegorical. But, it makes you very important. Things get very serious when this is the end of the world. And, humans just love that. And the bottom line is when you start getting into that kind of thinking, you become very self-important. And everything has a new degree of seriousness. When you say everything's going to be okay and we're just going to follow on the way, well, are people motivated? But hey, we're all going to die. People get it. So all this is very interesting, but apparently she really believed it. And whether she was any better than anybody else, well, obviously not. And like so many people who have failed using alternative medicine, which is why I'm always a person who believes in synergy, the best of what is working in practical allopathic medicine and the best in alternative. Use a synergy. There are places for that. She refused to take her medications, which certainly is understandable, and tried to use alternatives. Again, that's in her favor. But apparently they weren't getting much results. If you're going to constantly have brain seizures, then you're not going to function very well. On the other hand, if you take a bunch of regular medications, you don't function right either. So to think that maybe she should be on medications or not doing alternative stuff is nonsense. She followed her belief systems by trying to use a lot of energetic medicine to cure her problem. But I'm afraid, like so many of these treatments, or even regular medical treatments, they fail horrible. So it's not like there's a great success rate with allopathic medicine. Certain drugs do work. They generally have side effects, which can be worse than the illness. So like everything else, you have to really be careful. So she tried all that. It's not like she ignored it and just prayed to somebody. She had many, many different treatments going on. They tried to eat healthy. She stayed away from the toxic foods like garlic and onions, which disrupt mental capacities. And they, as told them by the Hindus and the other yogic teachers. So, I mean, she tried to take care of her situation. The problem is that with all these things, when you get into this, which seems to be a serious problem within the organization, what does it come down to? It always comes down to sex. And there's a real problem within the family unit, who all the daughters apparently, who usually have no problem whatsoever of not being sexual, wanted to hump like little babies. So the whole idea is that that became a big problem. I'm assuming there were some problems within the actual church with this as well, but it seems to be an overriding problem was involved, was the fact that stated by the actual family members is this was a big problem with them. And the rest of the beliefs weren't really a big problem. And they believed in all that stuff. And they didn't like the fact that she was a domineering leader mother. Well, who doesn't have those things from parents? So the whole idea is that having domineering, messed up parents, I certainly had two mentally ill parents, including a father who tried to murder me on 2 occasions. So what is the point of there? Well, if I had to trade the two, I think I would choose Elizabeth Clare Prophet over my psychotic father, the coward that he was. So the whole idea is that when you get into all these situations that are out there, I mean, who doesn't have these kind of family problems? The point is she shouldn't have put up with it. And if that meant starting her own little other group or enforcing her particular position, which she was supposed to take over the organization, well, that's what she should have done. And considering she basically felt that. But she, because life wasn't perfect for her, she rejected her belief systems. Well, as I said, it's kind of a up and down review here for this particular organization. Certainly, like everybody I've met, generally they always disappoint me, just as the person that I knew who was involved in this religion, who was kind of a jerk, and a liar, and lazy. Well, isn't that everybody? So you know a bunch of good stuff. One of the things that turned me off to religion in general is trying to get out of the church parking lot after Sunday Mass in a Catholic church where they would run you down. Nobody was saying, "Hey, buddy, we're all together here." No, they would try and get out of there, push you there, and treat you like scum. They were certainly highly unfriendly, and people didn't get together. So it was always that type of reality that you actually see in these organizations that turn you off. So it's not necessarily the teachings that are necessarily bad in most religions. It's the people involved with it, and particularly the leaders. So you see the nasty, bad attitude that of course, nuns and priests have bad attitudes. They're all horny. They have nothing. They're all shoved together in a big little boys or girls club. So the whole idea is that it's a real joke. No wonder they're nasty. No wonder nuns abuse people and priests. I had a priest one time who's giving confessions who was screaming because he didn't like what he heard. Well, isn't that nice? So all of these things of these typical nasty priests and the way they communicate and who gives a fuck about them, that's what it's developed. And then what happens is that when you actually put this together with belief systems, is it turns you off to the entire system. But what is it? It's the different people, and that means that the different people have to change the religion. So again, the book is Prophet's Daughter by Erin Prophet. These can be obtained online pretty inexpensively if you're looking to read this, if you want a kind of an idea of this kind of interesting alternative ascended master based religion. And as I said, these are available pretty much anywhere. Until next time.